In 2013, scientists made an interesting discovery in the Cima de los Huesos cave in Spain. They found human remains that were over 430,000 years old. But the most incredible thing turned out to be not the age, but the cause of death of this prehistoric human. After all, experts found two strange, identical holes in the skull. A fall or accidental injury could not have caused such perfectly symmetrical holes. Most likely they were the result of blows from a sharp stone spear or axe. In other words, the researchers found evidence of the first intentional murder in human history. But an even greater discovery awaited them because later, at the bottom of the same cave, they found at least 28 more skeletons with similar injuries. So this prehistoric murder was a mass killing. So does this mean that serial killers appeared even before the emergence of fully developed societies? In this video, you'll find out who managed to build a real palace for murder. Is it possible for a person to be possessed by the devil? Who took the lives of more than 300 children? And most importantly, how do people become serial killers? Some maniacs claim that evil forces order them to commit terrible crimes, but could there be even a grain of truth to this? Around 1570, the German town of Badberg was shaken by horrifying news. In a nearby forest, local residents found the body of a 9-year-old boy with a crushed skull. This incident became yet another in a series of gruesome murders. Moreover, each victim was mutilated beyond recognition. The child's death was the last straw, and the residents of Badberg decided to comb through the entire town and the surrounding forest to find the killer. However, this almost led to yet another death. Suddenly, a giant limb emerged from the darkness and grabbed one of the men tightly. Eyewitnesses claimed that it looked like a wolf's paw, but it had 5 human fingers. Fortunately, the man was armed with a knife, which he managed to stab into the monster's strange limb. However, immediately after that, the creature fled, and the frightened townspeople hurried home. One of the participants in that raid was Peter Stump, the father of the deceased boy. The townspeople did everything they could to support the man, since a few years earlier he had also lost his wife. Her body was found in a deep ravine after a storm. Most likely the woman lost her footing because of the strong wind. The day after the boy's death and the failed hunt, the townspeople decided to cheer Peter up a little and paid him a visit. However, during this visit, one of the guests noticed something strange. Stump hardly used his left hand, even though it had been perfectly fine the day before. The woman tried to examine Peter's hand, but the man began to resist. When she finally managed to pull up Stump's sleeve, everyone present was stunned. There was a deep, fresh cut on his arm, and it was completely covered in long, thick hair that resembled a wolf's fur. It was exactly such a disgusting limb that the townspeople had seen on the monster the day before. Peter Stump was immediately arrested and branded a werewolf. While in custody, the man said that he had once been a normal child, but everything changed when he turned 12. According to him, that was when the devil possessed him. After that, Peter supposedly learned to transform into a wolf, and a single thought never left his mind. The boy wanted to taste human blood. It was then that Peter committed his first murder. He strangled a local woman and then bit through her neck. He hid the unfortunate woman's body in the forest. Most likely her remains were later gnawed by wild wolves. That's why the townspeople didn't even consider the possibility of murder. The complete lack of any reaction from the public gave Peter more confidence, and the teenager decided to keep killing. And he managed to remain unpunished for almost 20 years. During this time, the werewolf took the lives of more than 30 people, including 2 pregnant women and his own wife. The storm was just a cover to get rid of the body. Peter's last victim was his own son. According to the man, he didn't want to do it, but the devil inside him once again ordered him to drink human blood. Besides the child, there was no one else with Peter at that time. After such a confession, the man was executed in the main square of the city, and his body was burned to make sure he would never turn into a wolf again. Over the centuries, this story has become shrouded in rumors. It is rumored that Peter Stump himself became the prototype for the ravenous wolf in the well-known tale of Little Red Riding Hood. But if we set aside the mystical elements, can the story of the Badberg werewolf explain how some people become serial killers. Some researchers believe that Peter Stump was not a half-wolf, but simply suffered from hypertrichosis. This condition causes uncontrolled hair growth on certain parts of the human body. That is why the man's hands resembled the paws of a wild beast. It was quite easy to hide this anomaly in the Middle Ages, since all clothing at that time had long sleeves. In addition, Peter testified that evil forces supposedly possessed him precisely when he became a teenager. Young people often cannot control their mood or restrain their aggression, so maybe Peter's devil was simply a strong hormonal imbalance that no one at the time could deal with. But millions of teenagers around the world go through various crises, and only a few of them become serial killers. So, does it mean that the reason for such extreme cruelty lies in something else? Over time, people began to explain excessively aggressive behavior, not by supernatural forces, but by various illnesses such as schizophrenia or hysteria. These were exactly the kinds of diagnoses attributed in 1896 to Henry Howard Holmes, the first officially registered serial killer in U.S. history. He chose this name for himself in honor of the famous detective. However, the pseudonym Moriarty would have suited him better, since in terms of cruelty he could have rivaled even the brilliant antagonist from Conan Doyle's works. It all began when Henry was just 10 years old. One day, some older boys decided to play a prank on him and locked him in the medical office, where there was a real human skeleton. They expected Henry to be frightened. Instead, the boy felt an incredible euphoria. Later, he recounted that voices appeared in his head, telling him that gazing upon dead bodies was his true calling. It was probably this very memory that determined Henry's future profession. In 1879, the young man enrolled in the medical faculty at the University of Michigan. During his studies, he stole corpses from the university laboratory, mutilated them, and staged accidents. Holmes passed off the bodies as those of people for whom insurance policies had previously been taken out. In this way, the young man collected other people's insurance payouts. Later, this allowed him to buy his own pharmacy. However, immediately after this, the previous owner of the pharmacy, who continued to live on the second floor of the same building, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Holmes claimed that she had gone to visit relatives in California and suddenly decided to stay there permanently. He himself began buying up property around the pharmacy and soon combined several buildings into one huge house, which the locals immediately dubbed the Castle. The building consisted of windowless labyrinths, staircases leading nowhere, and doors that could only be opened from the outside. During the construction of the castle, Holmes constantly changed contractors, so only he knew the final layout of the building. In 1893, during the Chicago World's Fair, Holmes decided to rent out some rooms in his castle to tourists. It was at that time that about 50 visitors to the event went missing without a trace. This aroused the suspicions of the police. The man was forced to leave the city for a while, but he did not miss the opportunity to profit from his departure. In St. Louis, Henry met a former criminal, Benjamin Pitezel. The latter agreed to carry out a scam together to fake his own death and split the insurance money with Holmes. There was only one thing the man didn't take into account, that Henry would arrange not a fake, but a real death for him. After Pitezel's death, the man also took the lives of his 3 daughters, but these victims became the last in the sinister story of Henry Holmes. One of the neighbors reported a man with strange behavior to the police, after which the maniac was finally apprehended. During the inspection of his castle, the investigators could not believe what they saw, as the entire building was essentially a killing machine. Holmes's arsenal included 2 giant furnaces, acid tanks, bottles of various poisons, and even a dryba, an ancient torture device. After hours of torture, the maniac would leave his victims to die in soundproof chambers. Each room in the building was equipped with special chutes through which the bodies of the unfortunate victims could be quickly sent down to the basement. There, Holmes would dismember them. Thanks to his old university connections, he was able to easily sell the skeletons and organs of his victims. According to police estimates, throughout his life, Henry Holmes took the lives of more than 300 people, although he himself confessed to only 27 murders. During the trial, the man insisted that it was other personalities living in his head who ordered him to kill. That is why the judges decided that Henry had schizophrenia. However, even this did not help him avoid the death penalty. On May 7, 1896, the man was executed. However, some modern experts believe that Holmes was not schizophrenic but simply pretended to be ill to gain sympathy. After all, people with such serious mental disorders are usually prone to uncontrollable and sudden outbursts of aggression. But they are definitely not capable of planning crimes in advance and concealing their intentions so thoroughly. And even if Henry Holmes did not have schizophrenia, something else could definitely have affected his psyche. A recent investigation revealed that Henry Holmes may have been subjected to domestic abuse by his parents during childhood. Perhaps this is what determined his future fate. At least, this is how another ruthless serial killer explained his own cruelty. In 1997, in the city of Pereira, Colombia, the police discovered a mass grave containing 25 bodies. They were in such a horrific state that investigators initially assumed a satanic cult was behind it. But it was later revealed that this was the work of just one person. After the first horrifying discovery, the police decided to thoroughly search the entire city and uncovered about a dozen more gruesome burial sites. Each grave contained between 3 and 20 bodies. Some of them had been dismembered, but the most horrifying thing was that all the victims were children, boys between 6 and 16 years old. Later, similar burial sites began to be found in other cities across Colombia. But who managed to commit so many murders and remain unpunished for so long? The answer was found quite unexpectedly. In one of the graves, investigators found a half-decayed piece of paper with an address on it. When they arrived at the location, they were met by a frightened young woman. She told them that she had been in a relationship with a man for several years. However, he constantly behaved very strangely. Every few months, he would leave for long business trips, could suddenly disappear and go somewhere in the middle of the night, and also had major issues with physical intimacy. This man turned out to be Luis Garavito, and he was soon arrested. During the interrogation, the maniac confessed to killing at least 140 boys in 54 cities across the country. However, investigators later suggested that the number of victims could have been twice as high. Moreover, the killer didn't even make much effort to hide his crimes. Political instability helped him remain unpunished. In 1964, a civil war broke out in Colombia. This led to the mass separation of children from their families. Hundreds of hungry boys and girls wandered the cities of Colombia. That's why, when a seemingly kind stranger approached them, they were only too happy for the chance to eat and, if they were lucky, spend the night in a warm bed. But for most of them, that night would be their last. At first, Garavito still tried to be careful. He would approach boys only in quiet rural areas and constantly changed his appearance. But after a few years, the man realized that no one was even trying to catch him, so he began abducting children right from crowded streets. He knew that these children were vulnerable, and no one would report their disappearance. After long walks intended to tire the child out, Garavito would tie up, torture, and rape his victims. The man told the police that he did all this because he could not forgive the violence from his own father, which he had suffered since childhood. But even such a confession did not soften his sentence: life imprisonment. But are childhood traumas really the reason for such incredible cruelty? Of course, abuse in childhood leaves a mark on a person's entire life. However, not all traumatized people become killers. In fact, for some people, such experiences become a source of remarkable altruism. For example, the famous American writer and poet Maya Angelou shared that, at the age of 8, she was subjected to brutal sexual abuse. This had such a profound impact on the child's psyche that she stopped speaking and remained silent for the next 5 years. However, it was precisely this experience that determined her future path. By the age of 17, she realized that she wanted to help other victims of abuse through her writing. So why didn't Luis Garavito choose the same path? Maybe it's not about what happens to a person, but about how they perceive it. Do serial killers really have physiological traits that lead to excessive cruelty? In 1974, a frightened woman called the Florida police station. Liz Kendall reported that the composite sketch of the serial killer, who had been wanted for several months, looked very much like her boyfriend. However, the police just laughed because Liz had been dating a qualified lawyer and psychologist for several years. In his spare time, the man also worked part-time at a crisis call center where he talked potential suicides out of taking their own lives. Could he really be a deranged killer rapist? If only the police had listened to the woman's words that evening, they could have saved the lives of at least 15 innocent girls. After all, Liz's beloved was Ted Bundy, one of the most ruthless maniacs in all of human history. It all began in 1968 when Ted was studying at the University of Washington. The young man was always attractive, so he had no trouble starting a relationship with Diane Edwards, a girl with a charming hairstyle who was considered the most beautiful woman in the entire university at the time. However, after just a few months, the couple began to quarrel, and Diane decided to break up with Ted. This was a real shock for the young man. He became disillusioned with women for life and decided to take cruel revenge on them. On January 4th, 1974, Ted Bundy began his hunt. Over the next few months, 8 girls disappeared in different states. The police didn't even connect these incidents since the geography of the crimes was too vast. But eventually, investigators determined that all the victims had common features. They were all very attractive and wore similar hairstyles. The same hairstyle that Ted's ex-girlfriend Diana once had, but the most horrifying thing was that the victims willingly went with the maniac. Usually, Ted would ask the girls to help him find a certain address. After that, the killer would start flirting, and none of the victims could resist his charm. After all, Ted was a natural-born actor and manipulator. When the girl finally got into Ted's car or entered a deserted place with him, he would immediately strike her on the head with a heavy object. Then the pervert would torment his victims in various ways and leave their bodies right in the forest. But in November 1974, Bundy finally made a serious mistake. One of his victims, 19-year-old Carol Duranch, managed to escape. After the girl identified the maniac in his car, they found a real killer's kit. Handcuffs, a ski mask, a crowbar, rope, a flashlight, tape, and an ice pick. Ted Bundy was finally arrested. At the court hearings, the man claimed he was innocent and smiled at the reporters. A few weeks later, Ted was sentenced, but he received only 15 years in prison. This was partly due to Ted's incredible charisma. Moreover, when he ended up in prison, he immediately befriended many of the guards. Some of them even bought the maniac his favorite snacks. But Ted himself only gained their trust in order to carry out his devious plan. And on December 30th, 1977, he managed to escape. The absence of the serial killer was not immediately noticed in the prison, and this gave him the opportunity to fly to Chicago. At first, Bundy planned to lay low and start a new life. However, in a remarkably short period, specifically less than 2 full weeks, he began to feel an overwhelming and undeniable urge to kill once again. On January 15, 1978, in Florida, Ted raped 4 girls, 2 of whom he later killed. The monster's last victim was 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. When Ted Bundy was caught for the second time, investigators had already gathered a pile of irrefutable evidence of his guilt, including bite marks on the bodies of some of the victims that matched molds of Ted's jaws. On January 24, 1989, the killer was executed in the electric chair. Ted Bundy himself became the prototype for the chilling character in the film American Psycho. But why couldn't the maniac stop even after escaping when he himself wanted a peaceful life? Immediately after the execution, Bundy's body was autopsied and his brain began to be studied by scientists. At that time, no pathologies were found in the organ. However, modern researchers are convinced that the maniac's head simply did not obey its owner. Neurobiologist James Phelan has spent decades studying the brains of psychopathic killers and concluded that they truly have a different physiology, with less gray matter and a lack of activity in the areas responsible for empathy and fear. Judging by this, it appears that some individuals are simply born to kill, and there is absolutely nothing they can do about it. However, in 2009, there was an unexpected twist in James Phelan's research when the neurobiologist examined his own brain scan. he discovered that he himself had all the pathologies he had previously found in serial killers. In subsequent interviews, the scientist noted that he had never experienced sudden outbursts of aggression or cruelty, but he often suffered from his impulsive decisions, excessive fondness for alcohol, and pathological lying. Phelan suggested that such character traits could well have formed the basis for psychopathic tendencies. But what saved the man was his wonderful family, where the children's mental health was treated with great care. So maybe someone you know, or even you yourself, could potentially have become a serial killer. It's the perfect time to thank your family and friends for their love and acceptance. Isn't that right?